Hello, good morning. My name is Inês Rugani. I'm a faculty member in the nutrition department of the University of Rio de Janeiro. I am very happy to be the moderator of this roundtable called New Theoretical Approaches of the Food Environment. The reason why we included this roundtable in our agenda is the importance to make progress in the construction of theoretical models to broaden the understanding of food environments, their characterization, and their relationships with food choices and food endpoints, as well as its relationship with sustainability. We know that available models include, to a greater or lesser degree, elements, dimensions that are micro relevant, and characteristics of the communities that are part. There are efforts to give examples of environments according to different examples. The different typologies contribute to the broadening of the repertoire of the explanation of the dynamics of these areas with more appropriate models for studies on public policies that depend from their objectives. To contribute to the dialogue on this topic, we invited three researchers that have contributed with very relevant contributions for this debate with theoretical models that translate the complexity of food environments in the current context. I would like to deeply thank, on behalf of the organizing committee, for your participation. We will have the three presentations, 25 minutes each, and a Q&A session. During the presentations, please write your questions in the Q&A option. We will start with the topic, conceptual model of the study of food environments in Chile. Patricia Galvez-Espinosa with a degree in nutrition, with a master's degree in human nutrition, with a PhD in nutrition, and assistant faculty in the University of Chile, School of Medicine. Thank you, Patricia, for your presentation. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I was speaking Spanish. I'll try to slow down in spite of the fact that I am very, very fast, but I try to slow down for the interpreters. Let me share my presentation. I hope you can see my shared screen. Thank you very much, Inez, for your comments. I will not introduce myself any further. You have said everything relevant about myself, but I would like to talk about this concept model we have been working on for many years now in Chile. And my presentation is organized as follows. First, a general outlook of the model, why we're thinking about this model, the study that created this model. And the third part of my presentation will focus on the model itself and its determinants with final conclusions and take-home messages. Well, the starting point is, why was this model created? This chart shows the overweight context in my country. We carried out 3 surveys in 2003, 2009, 2020, and 2016 and 2017. And when we talk about morbid obesity, it has increased twofold. And likewise, for obesity, almost 10 percentage points, and overweight has increased slightly, but increased anyway. And ultimately, when we carried out this concept model, there were very high obesity and overweight rates in Chile. And by 2007, studies showed that 1 every 11 death was related to overweight. And today, obesity has very high costs for our states. In Chile, it's 1.4 billion pesos, 1% of our GDP. So this is a rather high cost related to this disorder in our country. Even though our number one problem was malnutrition, today obesity and overweight is a challenge that public health in our country is facing. On the other hand, the food survey carried out a couple of years ago shows that if we see which are the food guides and the compliance of these food guides in our country, none fulfills 100% levels. water percentage, fruit and produce, dairy products, beans, fish. It doesn't even reach 60%. And look at the disadvantage for the lower quintiles. On the other hand, Chile, and for more than 1 year now, is one of the countries with highest sale and consumption of highly processed foods. So our population has a high prevalence of nutrition-related disorders, diabetes, hypertension, of course, obesity. Almost 70% of our population is overweight or obese. So there is a food-related problem. On the other hand, as of the year 2000, there has been more evidence on the complexity of food behaviors and this complexity when it comes to changing unhealthy food behavior. There is more evidence in the fact that choice of food goes beyond the fact of whether you know how to eat well or not. It does not depend on a level of knowledge alone. And lately, in 2002, food environment, obesogenic environments, food deserts, and other terminologies have arisen. I would like to share some documents with you which are key in my research. This paper is one of the most important papers in food environments relating eating environments and healthy food, talking about the cost of food available for people in these environments and the relationship of the availability with obesity. Another very important paper is this one on screen, Healthy Nutrition Environment Concepts and Measures by Karen Glantz on the topic of food environments and how environments influence behavior. And then we have this paper by Mary Story, Creating Healthy Food and Eating Environments, which has to do with policies and approaches that can create healthier environments. Her team says that we shouldn't focus on individual habits for behavior changes and the need to go beyond individual choices to broader policies. And this is the starting point for our study. And of course, we do have certain food behaviors, but are conditioned by the environment that will define what I buy and what I eat. This drawing is really fantastic since it shows what we go through currently in Chile. We're bombarded, in spite of the fact that there is a legal framework for ads. You go out to the streets, and Instagram, Facebook, and the billboards, and everything you see, you are visually exposed. The eating environment is much less healthier than it should. So, based upon this high prevalence of obesity, eating behavior disorders, sedentary habits, the Health Ministry in 2015 called for bids for a qualitative cross-cutting study, and the University of Chile was the bidder that was selected. And we at the university wanted to focus on the approach from a literature review, focusing on studies that focused on the possibility to change and shift behaviors through changing eating habits. That was the first thing, literature review. Then we held different meetings. Chile is a large country with different climates, different contexts. So what we wanted to do was really to focus on the particular characteristics of the northern, central, and southern regions. So we organized different meetings with specialists. And then the second part of the proposal was to carry out an online survey to create a model that was introduced to our communities, organized society, civil society, and meetings to see what the perception of civil society and society as a whole was about this model. Which was the starting point? Of course, the starting point is what we actually have. We used this health social determinants by Irwin and Soler, the economic and social model of these determinants, health determinants, and determinants of behavior. And this last model that I shared a minute ago on eating environments. So everything that was found in literature, we tried to tailor it to our three approaches, and we wanted to create our first model after our literature review. We have used components from glances, eating environments, the community eating environment, information environments with social determinants, and some contributions of other literature reviews. So as a whole, we focused on our food systems and the culture that, of course, is the underlying foundation of all of our models. So this is what we proposed, and we carried out a survey in which all our specialists could vote, and this was the result. This final model has 5 eating environments. We have the determinants of the environments, which are closer, and other determinants that are further removed. And this is also part of the national food environment and culture. So the core of our model is the person, the individual person that will move around these eating environments that are determined by the variables we have around. So now let's focus on the different eating environments. We decided to choose 5. Glenn's model has 4, but with the contributions and the comments by our specialists, we decided to choose 5 environments. And when we tried to define which each of this environment was, what we found in the literature was that there were very diverse definitions. Some focus on food access and availability, and others definitions focus on the different interactions at play in these relationships. Our model really is based on everything we found in literature when we define eating environments, but we also found intermediary determinants. There are 5 environments. We have the restoration eating environment, that is everything that has to do with catering of food in hotels, restaurants, and bars. We have the street eating environment, street food, advertising in the streets. We have institutional eating environments, universities, schools, which are the canteens in schools and universities, and the home environment, when you close the door at home and when you eat your meals at home. And this is where we have most interactions and complexities, because it is the primary eating environment when you learn how to like and love certain flavors and foods, and is one of the most diverse food environments because each home differs from the other, and it is one of the most difficult to change because it's difficult to be allowed in a home. And we have the last one, the 5th, which is the supply eating environment. That is, first, the availability of foods through ads, labels, display of food, but the supply environment is the most important one because it is the supply of our food. So without the supply environment, there would be no other type of environment because the supply environment makes available healthy or unhealthy environment. And that is why we have these arrows, because the supply environment interacts with the other four environments: the restaurant environment, the public and street environment, the institutional environment, and the home environment. So, of course, we could say that some environments are equal, but what is the situation when you take to the office, school, or university your snack from school, your snack from home, your meal from home? So there's an interaction between the home food environment with the university food environment, because you take your meals, you prep them at home, and you eat your meals at the university. So all of the environments are closely interconnected. This definition perfectly explains what these five food environments mean. And it says that these environments are everything that is not identified as an individual factor. That's an interesting definition. Nothing related with cognition, beliefs, skills. This is a potential determinant of the food environment. Now, I would like to talk about these determinants, which are the direct determinants. Well, the food industry is ultimately the one that manufactures and makes available food in this food environment. It is important to ultimately say that industry produces the ultra processed and industrialized food products that are available in our supermarkets. Industry is very powerful as far as marketing is concerned, and food companies invest in marketing, unlike what is the situation by the promotion of healthy foods by the state. There is large competition in the industry. And when it comes to trying to make a difference between healthy and unhealthy products, the industry has more power. And what about public policies related to nutrition and food that ultimately, of course, control industry? The legal framework controls the industry, but as well can deform food environments, because ultimately the legal framework is responsible for legislation, rules and regulations that will control the sale of food products and to protect consumers, trying to provide harmless foods. So these are the primary determinants of the environments. There are other food environment determinants, which are the social determinants. And these social determinants are also health determinants. These determinants are very well known, but it has to do with health social determinants, because of course your social class, gender, ethnic origin is related to education, job, puts us in a different position and in a different relationship with food environments. And everything that takes place at social and economic level, at a macro level at your country, affects your decision and your behavior on what to purchase and what to buy and consume. And the larger food system as a whole ultimately manufactures, transports everything that we eat and is available, and this is closely related to food security and ultimately food culture. What if the food system produces something? Our food culture will be the one that will ultimately choose what food you want. And our culture also will establish which foods are available according to the seasons, according to the regions, and according to our culture. So these are the larger or broader determinants that affect our food environment models. And to conclude, I wanted to talk about the core of our model, which are people, individuals, persons. In fact, we could place individuals or persons in any eating environment with preferences, attitudes, knowledge. Any individual does not necessarily follow what that specific eating environment makes available as a healthy choice. So there is an interaction, of course. And of course, when we talk about individuals and persons that are the social capital, there is a support network that shifts the location of persons in the model. So, as a conclusion, I would like to say that these five eating environment models interact amongst themselves. It is very difficult to specifically limit each environment. We need to identify determinants that are further removed from the core with certain determinants. But the good thing about this model is that it gives us a comprehensive outlook to analyze and understand demographic behaviors. And we can understand why there are certain situations in the north of the country compared to the south part of the country where the consumption of produce is totally different uh, due to the different eating environments and determinants, health determinants on these environments, which are totally different in the north or the south of the country and that are differently presented. And this model has been used in different studies at national level in Chile. But a very important thing is that this model was used as the basis for our national food and nutrition policy. The components of our policy include the possibility to improve food system and food environments. So this national policy, which is the basis for our interventions and rules and regulations and provides the legal framework, focuses on these food environments, which was not present in our legislation before. Which is the way forward and the challenges of the model? Well, this was developed between 2015 and 2021. A lot of things have changed, including the pandemic. Our economy has shifted and changed. So we have to update our model because today we have another very strong environment that will be mentioned, which is the digital food environment. It is a new environment and little is known about this digital or online food environment. And we have to really think about this new environment and what is the interaction of this online food environment with the rest of the environments. And we have to focus on follow up of these environments. There are some instruments and guides. The ones that I'm familiar with are the ones by its NIMS, by Glanz's team, that helps us focus on certain aspects within these eating and environments. But they mostly talk about scarcity or availability of food, and we don't talk about interactions of different environments. And to conclude, these this model, this food environment model, focuses on the possibility to have comprehensive and related policies so that we can really stop the increase of overweight and obesity in the country. And I know I'm running late, but I guess that this is a great opportunity because we, as a work team at the university, are struggling for the inclusion of the right to healthy food in the Constitution, the right to have access to food, and the inclusion of this as a legislation in the new Constitution. So, to wrap up, I would like to say that the purpose of all of these initiatives and the ultimate purpose of our model is to have cross-cutting interventions. Nutrition is not the only component, and education is not the only component, because no matter how well educated you are, we cannot shift behaviors if there is no support and favorable environment. I would like to thank the Health Ministry that gave us the possibility to create this model, and the team of authors. Some are present here in the seminar as participants. It is not my model. This model belongs to all of us, authors, specialists, and participants. This is my email address. Feel free to send me an email if you want information or make comments or ask me questions on our model. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you very much for your participation. And now we will follow with our next speaker that will talk about the incorporation of sustainability in theoretical models in the eating environment. And we invite Shauna Downs, that has a bachelor's degree in science and metabolic science with a PhD in public health. And she's an assistant faculty at the Institute of Rutgers University School of Public Health.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to speak about food environment theoretical models. First of all, I just apologize for not being able to speak in Portuguese. I will speak in English, but try, like Patricia said, try and speak slowly, which is not usually my forte. So the title of my talk is Incorporating Sustainability into Food Environment Theoretical Models. So I'll start off by just describing where the food environment sits in the food system. And a lot of this is very similar to what Patricia already mentioned in her talk, but it's just viewing it in a different way, so conceptualizing it in a different manner. So basically, when we think about food environments, they're the point in the food system that consumers interact with to make decisions about which foods to acquire, purchase, and then later consume. So if you're thinking about the food system, which this figure is using a socio-ecological model to think about the food system, you have diets, if we're interested in diets and changing food choice at the core. And then you have individual factors, which were some of the aspects that Patricia was mentioning, things like preferences, your knowledge, your ability to cook, or your knowledge related to cooking. And then when you interact with the food environment, all of these individual factors come with you. So that knowledge, that income level, your ability to access the market in terms of mobility and transportation, all of that influences how you interact with the food environment. And then we have sectors of influence that influence the food environment. These include things like industry, as Patricia mentioned, trade, technology, agriculture, and the food supply chains that feed into the food environment. Then we have socio-cultural and political environments, and these include things like culture, conflict, laws, governance, all these types of things that are later influencing the sectors of influence, the food environments, individual factors, and then later diets. And then broadly, overarching this whole system are ecosystems. And we know that climate variability and climate change is influencing each of these spheres of the socio-ecological model of the food system. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sustainability and how it should be accounted for within the food environment and within our conceptual models related to the food environment. So as many of you are likely aware, there are many, many definitions of the food environment. And the food environment research really began, a couple decades ago now, including with Karen Glenn's work. And it's evolved over time. And this definition of the food environment is one that myself and my colleagues use because we think it helps in terms of thinking about the different dimensions of the food environment, but also the different types of food environment. So we define the food environment as the consumer interface with the food system that encompasses the availability, affordability, convenience, quality and promotion, and sustainability of foods and beverages in wild, cultivated, and built spaces that are influenced by the socio-cultural and political environment and ecosystems within which they are embedded. And so I understand that's a mouthful, and it's a very long and dense definition. So I'll walk you through those different components over the course of this slide and the next. So in terms of the dimensions of the food environment, we have the promotion of foods, how foods are presented, marketed, promoted in our environments. We have the affordability of food, which is really an interaction between the price of food, which is in the external food environment, and our income, which is an individual factor, or in some cases, this is called the personal food environment. Then you have the availability of foods, so which foods are available within the environment, the convenience, so the time cost of obtaining, preparing, and consuming a food item. And then you have quality, so things like the nutrient content, the freshness, the food safety aspects. And then lastly, something that we added as part of our definition of the food environment was sustainability properties. And these really entail the environmental and social impacts associated with the food item that is included in our food environments. So I mentioned within the definition of the food environment types. And this is also something that myself and my colleagues have done a lot of work on over the last few years, based on a lot of the research we've done, particularly in low and middle income countries. So while we were often talking about the food environment from a high income context or from an upper middle income context, in terms of the built and usually formal food environment, which includes a lot of the environments that Patricia was talking about. So things like mobile vendors, online vendors, retailers, schools, restaurants, supermarkets, all of those fit within the formal built environment. But we also see an informal market, and that includes things like wet markets, those that are not regulated, street vendors in many places, kiosks or boutiques that we often see in rural areas in low and middle income countries, as well as mobile vendors. So these two different types of built environments are included within our food environment typology. And so the majority of the food environment research has been really focused primarily on the formal food environment, especially in the US. So a lot of the work that's been done that's looked at, say, the relationship between food environments and diets has looked at GIS coordinates of fast food restaurants or, say, supermarkets, and then looked at the impact on, say, or the influence or association with, say, obesity or diet quality. And in reality, we don't see really strong relationships between these two, because it doesn't reflect the true way in which consumers interact with their environments. Because we, as we know, as consumers, we don't always just interact with the food access points that are within a mile of our houses or our apartments. So that's something to keep in mind. And when we're thinking about the food environment typologies, it's really about identifying all the food environment types that people interact with, and then characterizing them so we understand the availability, the affordability, the quality, the sustainability, and convenience of those foods. So I mentioned the built food environment. We also have the natural food environment. And this is an aspect that we included as part of our definition that was relatively new within the food environment literature. So within the natural food environment, we have two types of food environments: the wild food environment, and this includes things like natural lakes, seas, ponds, forests or jungles, disturbed habitat. And then we have the cultivated food environment. And when we're talking about the cultivated food environment, this is really cultivation that is for home consumption. So we're not talking about, say, the farmers in the US, in Ohio, who are producing corn or soy. We're talking about farmers that are producing foods that they're also consuming within their household. So not ingredients for ultra-processed foods, but actual foods. So within the cultivated environment, you have things like aquaculture, gardens, fields, orchards, etc. And just in terms of the way that we're interacting with the food environment and some of the changes that we've seen over the course of the pandemic, is that we have seen more of an uptake of natural food environments. So in the US, we saw more people trying to garden. It actually led to seeds being sold out in many places. And then we also saw people doing more activities within the wild food environment, including things like fishing. So just to give you a sense of what these food environment types look like, this is from some work that I've done in India. And you can see this on the left is the cultivated food environment. So these are the different grains that were being grown in this indigenous community in Jharkhand state in India. These were different species that were fished from the river or stream nearby the community. So this is part of the wild food environment. So they consume a variety of different species that are often very nutrient rich. And this is a tamarind tree that's from the jungle next to the village that we were working in. So these are wild food environments, and then you have the cultivated. Now, alongside those natural food environments, people within those communities are also accessing the built food environment, and it's primarily the informal markets. So you have, for example, wet markets like this one, and you have often these little boutiques or kiosks in rural villages. And I know it's kind of hard to see in the slide, but hopefully you can see that this is a very remote village in India, and you still see a lot of ultra-processed foods being sold. So even among the poorest populations and the most remote, you still see this access within the food environment of ultra-processed foods. So when we're thinking about food environments and the different types of food environments, they're really transitioning globally. So while initially in hunter-gathering societies, and this slide is based on the nutrition transition slide by Barry Popkin, you had more of a reliance on wild food environments. Then came the cultivation and cultivated food environment, then informal food environment, and over time, we're increasing our reliance on the built food environment. So for example, in countries like the US, the majority of our food is coming from the formal market. However, as I mentioned, as there's this push towards more sustainability, there's this uptake of more cultivation. So people are starting to grow more food themselves. Urban agriculture is becoming more important in many cities. And there's more of a reliance on, or an emphasis, I should say, on sustainability properties. So we might see this shift in terms of the types of food environments that we have access to moving forward. So where does sustainability fit in all of this? So food environments need to make sustainable diets available, affordable, appealing, and aspirational in the context of people's lives. So they really need to be prominent within our food environments, within the different types of food environments. And it has to be easy for people to access sustainable diets, to acquire the foods that make up sustainable diets, and then to later consume them. So over the next few slides, I'm just going to talk a little bit about sustainability properties within the food system or within the food environment and the different types of food environments. So this slide is, I know, a little bit hard to see in terms of the size of the font. This is the reference on the bottom for the study in case you want to look at it in more detail. But basically what we've done in this is looked at what are the sustainability properties of wild, cultivated, informal, and formal built environments. And when we think about the wild food environment as it is today, generally there's a low carbon footprint of the foods that are acquired from that environment. So foods tend to be consumed as local and seasonal. So as an example of that, in the communities that I work in India, for example, during mushroom season, they will go forage for mushrooms in the jungle that surrounds their village. You also see the same thing in parts of New York and other parts of the US and Europe as well. But there's different times within the year that wild foods become more available. And one of the things that's really important about these wild food sources is that they tend to be very nutrient rich. So you see a lot of leafy greens, for example, that are available within wild food environments. And then you see a lot of animal source foods that can be quite nutritious, but also have a lower carbon footprint than a lot of the animal source foods that are produced in more industrialized systems. From the cultivation standpoint, there are other sustainability properties that are influencing our food environments. For example, things like food loss, land tenure issues, those affect the cultivated environment, and are thinking about the more broad aspects of sustainability and sustainable diets, because it does include both the social and environmental component. When we're thinking about the informal built environment, in general, we tend to see lower levels of things like packaging that we see in the built environment, in the formal built environment. So within the formal built environment, the sustainability properties include things like high amounts of food packaging, high amounts of food waste, and a variety of other things. Poor equity within the food system as it relates to labor rights and equity. So there's a variety of different sustainability properties that can be thought of within the food environment. However, we know that the food environment is the point within the food system that consumers interact with to make decisions about which foods to acquire and consume. So how are they even able to know which foods are sustainable? Because a lot of these properties, you know, as a consumer, if you're, say, going to the grocery store, you're not going to know the carbon footprint of the food that you're consuming. So moving forward in the last few years, I should say, there's been more of an emphasis on these types of properties within the built food environment. So you're seeing a lot more labeling of, so this is a cereal and it's a climate smart. It says soil health and water health have been, are good within this product. You also, this is an example of carbon footprint label, which I don't find to be very interpretable myself. It doesn't really seem to indicate that it's a low carbon food, but that's the idea of this label, which is being used in some fast food restaurants in the US. Another aspect of sustainability that consumers can actually see is the packaging. So this is an example of where you might have a trade-off between health and sustainability properties within the food environment. So you can see here that there's all these vegetables and they're covered in plastic. So rather than just being able to pick them up yourself and put them in, say, the carry bag that you brought with you to the grocery store, you have to have this product that has a lot of plastic. And you often see this, at least in the US, with organic products. So if you want to, say, buy organic bananas, there's a lot of packaging on those organic bananas that you don't see in bananas that are conventionally produced. So again, consumers need to make a trade-off in terms of the health aspect and the sustainability aspect. So when we're thinking about how to measure food environments and how to measure sustainability, it requires many different tools to be used. So we know, for example, for measuring the availability of foods, we can use things like the NEM surveys, which Patricia mentioned. We can also, assess the food prices of different foods. But when it comes to sustainability, there's really little research done on how to measure it within the food environment. So this slide is just taking a little excerpt from our paper where we summarized all the tools that could be used to assess the availability, affordability, convenience, promotion and quality, and sustainability properties within different food environment types. And we look, the different colors here relate to objective measures of the food environment, and the lighter are perceived measures. Because we know, and I know this through a lot of the research I've done, particularly qualitative work, that there's often a disconnect between the perceived food environment and the objective food environment. So for example, I do a lot of work in informal settlements or in slum populations in Nairobi in Kenya. And what you often see in those locations is that you will have say, high levels of or high perceptions that there's a lack of food safety. So people will think that there's very high levels of pesticides, or that there's food safety issues related to antibiotic use in the foods that they have access to within the slums. However, if you were to do tests of those food items, you might see that actually the level of contamination is quite low, which has been shown in some of the slums in Nairobi. So while consumers perceive, in particular, fruits and vegetables to have a very high level of pesticides, which makes them not want to purchase them, they actually don't contain high levels of pesticide. So that's why it's important to be measuring both the perceived environment, but also the objective food environment. In terms of sustainability perspectives, though, or properties, we really see very few tools that assess sustainability properties, whether they be objective or perceived. So there's one study that was done in Australia that was measuring the cost of a healthy and sustainable food basket. And then there have been some studies that have looked at specific sustainability properties, including things like labels. But that's really the extent of it to date. So there's a real need to develop new tools that can measure both the perceived and the objective environment as it relates to sustainability properties. So as part of some of the work that I'm doing with my colleagues at Montana State, Selena Ahmed and Anna Herforth at the University of Harvard, we're working on the development of a toolbox that could be used to measure the different dimensions of the food environment across different types of the food environment. So the idea of this toolbox, which we received a grant from the MANA Grants program, which is funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and UK DFID, is to develop tools to measure the availability, affordability, promotion and quality, convenience, and also sustainability properties of wild, cultivated, and built food environments. So the idea is at the end of this grant, we will have a toolbox that is ready to use for different researchers that will include not just the tools, but also protocols in terms of how to implement them in the field. And the idea with this is to then be able to allow us to better characterize food environments in their entirety, because we know that the different dimensions influence food choice. And so it's not enough to just measure the availability of foods. We also have to assess other components that determine or influence people's food choice. It will also allow us to measure the changes within the food environment over time and compare them across different country contexts, or even within a given country, because we know that in some parts of a country, the food environments types and the dimensions within them might look very different than other regions within that same country. And why that's important is because it informs which interventions we might use in that context. And so to develop interventions that will really influence food choice and that are grounded in the lived experiences of people, we really need to have a better understanding of the food environment in all its dimensions. So hopefully this toolbox will allow us to do that in more detail. So with that, I will wrap up my talk, but I look forward to the questions, and thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Shauna. Fantastic. What an inspiring presentation. Thank you very much. So we invite our third speaker. Our third speaker, Sabrina, will talk about a theoretical model for the digital food environment. She's a dear researcher from Brazil. She has a graduation in nutrition, and she has a specialization in social specialties, and she is a PhD student at the Inland Norway University. Thank you, Sabrina, for your participation. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today and to share for the first time my research. So I don't know if um, it'll be perfect, but well, as you know, my PhD dissertation focuses on the theoretical model of the digital food environment and the relationship between digital technologies and food environment. I could elaborate on the methodology, the approach of the topic, because my focus is to build a very theoretical approach. But since we're really pressed for time, I will not focus on the methodology, but I am available for any further clarifications later. And I will focus on the debate and the final results in the mapping of the digital food environment based upon this article published at, in 2019, the digital food environment at the UNSCN publication of the United Nations in the Nutrition newsletter. And it focuses on my research focus and an article that we published at Wiley, which is a systematic review and a mapping of digital food environment literature to try to understand the current state of literature in terms of components, theory, and the impact of digital food environments in health sciences. So I will focus on the results of these two articles. I would like to start by saying that there are different approaches to understand a digital food environment, but the approach that we have focused on is essential because there is an interconnection between natural sciences and social and human sciences, because food is a biological and a cultural phenomenon which is leveraged when we talk about the role of information and the changes of our food culture and how this changes the way we talk about food that goes well beyond how much food is sold or how many calories are consumed, because actually we need to focus on this twofold approach, which is a dialogue between natural sciences and social sciences. That is a union of these two sciences. The focus of my research, digital food environment, is a growing topic. This chart from 2021 shows, and the sample was articles published since 2020, the year 2000 to 2019. Look at the increase of published papers on topics related to the intersection between digital technologies and food environments. There is a growing interest on this, and we have learned increasingly on this topic, which is rather an infant topic. The World Health Organization, the European Regional Office, started a, a study, and they have published this sheet called Digital Food Environments, where this topic is part of the European region's political agenda. They are trying to define what a digital food environment is, and I translated the definition into Portuguese. Digital food environments are the online settings through which flows of services and information that influence people's foods, nutrition choices, and behavior are directed. So this definition clearly includes services and information, two types of products that can be considered, and the Health Organization's definition talks about digital food environments, which are essential as the environment for nutritional choices and decisions. This article, published in 2019, talks about digital environments that are an essential role in this relationship. And I will start talking about this relationship. The model as a whole includes players and stakeholders that are part of the digital food environment, starting with digital actors, government, food industry, civil society organizations, etc., as new players, as social networking services, influencers, and also we have included different activities that are performed online and the impact this analog outcome has an influence on our physical influence. And I say quote unquote because I say that the digital environment is as real as the physical environment. So I will talk about each of the components. And since the World Health Organization defined these digital space environments, I will start talking about each one. The model we created in 2019 includes digital environments as follows: social media, sites, apps, online communities, Reddit, Facebook groups, discussion forums, hashtags, games, wikis, etc. But what do I mean when I talk about environment? Well, when we talk about the daily life, that is where families, individuals, communities, and all configurations, configurations, where do we carry out our daily activities? Where do we socialize, work, play, work out, learn, purchase? These are all of the different aspects of our daily activities. We take care of ourselves, we take care of our families, we take care of our health, we access services, we play, we have fun. The food environment could be understood as environment in which we carry out all of the activities I mentioned before. It could be an environment where we have access to products, information, services related to food and nutrition. One of these environments could be our home, the supermarket, formal or informal, as Shauna mentioned, supermarket fairs, street food, restaurants, cafes. But when we talk about environments themselves, there are several others. Our workplace, schools, universities, public and public spaces, entertainment, theaters, places where we can work out, gyms. And when we talk about the health system, hospitals, healthcare facilities, and when we talk about the new digital food environment, we also need to include our digital environments and the use of digital technologies of all of the other regular food environment spaces. Digital technologies is present in all of these areas and it can relate to all of our activities and is an evolution of the model we had in mind in 2019 when we talked about the online environment, which I see differently today because digital technology is present in all physical environments and spaces, apart from the fact that there are exclusively digital spaces like the apps, social media, virtual worlds, games, online communities, and information platforms. So these are the environments and the spaces that in our concept make up the digital food environment. Our systematic review went over digital spaces that build the digital food environment, which are increasingly present in the studies that we analyzed. That is, the most studied environments included in these papers are, as we see on screen, digital TV and streaming, online communities, games, and other environments, social media, websites, multimedia environment, and online food vendors, a 95%. And of course, online technology is present in all of these areas. So we think about these physical, digital, online spaces, which are the activities that consumers or stakeholders perform within these spaces. There are a number of activities. For instance, we can talk about health promotion activities, healthy food campaigns, apps that monitor food consumption, wearables, smart watches, and other devices that we can use and are currently being used in some government initiatives for health promotion campaigns. And of course, the digital food environment is subject to nutrition and food policies. And of course, there is a legal framework that's applicable to this environment. But since I cannot talk about everything that defines digital food environment, I will focus on marketing, digital marketing that is online, purchase, and information, as Patricia mentioned, information, news, videos, recipes, etc. So the activities that take place are divided in our model in two ways: material and social interactions. So let me start with material interactions. And this has to do with digital marketing, which is one of the most researched areas in the technology food interaction. Digital marketing is everywhere: social media, sites, games. Digital marketing is visible in our lives, and we can really see how heavily the food industry has invested in marketing, digital marketing. In the past, the industry created ad advert games trying to make teenagers play games with a brand of products. But now, with the flourishing of social media, these advert games have changed, and we see that there are different partnerships with digital influencers. And on Facebook and social media, there are competitions and games. Everybody participates. Uh, Participants are invited to participate and share. And of course, there are campaigns, and they increase the reach of these campaigns that in the past were launched on TV. So these digital marketing campaigns have fantastic reach in social media. This is a Norwegian digital influencer. He never talks about nutrition or food. This is a video in which this Norwegian influencer talks about obnoxious people and or irritating people, and he included the ad of this yogurt. So this was clearly open digital marketing. It wasn't hidden or in any way. So these influencers are also working on this area, these young influencers. Another interesting interaction in the digital food environment is food marketing. Each of these items could be a presentation in itself. If we talk about online food marketing, because there are, of course, online supermarkets. You can purchase everything online. You don't need to go to the supermarket anymore, which, of course, gained momentum with the pandemic. But we have other services as delivery apps. I don't know how this is in Brazil, but in Norway, we have different services, which are companies that give you a weekly menu. You purchase the menu for a number of persons, and you get the products and the recipes to cook that menu. So there are different models, do it yourself, uh, different interfaces with digital technology. Of course, there is a marketing interface, but there are many other things we need to think about, as for instance, the positioning of products. When you want to purchase a product in a online site, when a site is well designed, and look at these heat maps. You look at the screen and you take longer in certain areas or choices. So products can be positioned on the screen to make you purchase something or not. So these are different marketing strategies that we as users don't understand, but I don't know, for instance, if on the other picture we have these kiosks. McDonald's has these digital vending machines. You go to McDonald's, but you don't talk with anybody. You choose what you want to have on this machine, on this vending machine, and the positioning of the items, recommendation algorithms, recommendations for myself according to my age and gender profile would be recommendations for me that are different from other persons. So all of the elements that have an influence on our food choices and our different preferences are not very well understood, as well as food labeling. Because if we think about, as Joanna mentioned, the different labels, brands, and how consumers understand this and how this is positioned, we have to think about the fact that if we have an interaction between interaction and food mediated by a smartphone or a screen, the way we think food or product labels is different. And right now, we do not have studies to know how this really works. And we don't even have, in the different countries, we don't even have a legal framework or a framework that is really adapted to this online availability of products. But actually, when we talk about social media and social network interaction, that doesn't necessarily have to do with products or food. We need to focus on social media. Look at these support groups in social media in topics that are related to food and nutrition. We have a Facebook group, and this is a very important group. I had a lot of trouble breastfeeding, and this group was a source of inspiration. It was my support group that contributed for my personal success as a mother to be successful breastfeeding because I went through difficult moments. And there are other hashtags and other organizations and groups in social media that help people. For instance, we can use different hashtags, breastfeeding or diabetic children. There are hashtags. The hashtag is here in Portuguese, but it's a hashtag of moms with diabetic children. So we believe that there is a lot of interaction. And of course, we have a new food culture, a new way to deal with foods, as well as there are very important examples of very problem hashtags or problem groups, digital influencers that share fake news, or this hashtag called Fitspiration, where there is a link between the use of this type of negative hashtags and body image or eating disorders. Some hashtags were forbidden because of this association, and there are different faces of what goes on in social media. We can think about influencers that maybe influence good sites or good pieces of advice, or influencers that instead of informing disinform. But we can also think about health professionals, scientific influencers, and all of those that really do focus on science and work with social media. Look at these examples. This very famous Brazilian medical doctor, Dr. Drauzio Varela, he's a very well known physician that is always talking about fitness and nutrition. And we also have a very well known cook here in Brazil called Rita Lobo that is always giving recipes with Brazilian products. And we also have a lot of very scientific professionals. So these spaces, health professionals can occupy these spaces as an opposition to negative digital influencers or fake news. So this is a shared space with celebs. Jamila Jamil, she has a podcast with a very important campaign that's called I Weigh, to fight against body image in social media. I mean, I could talk about this for hours, but I know that we're really running late. But well, these social interactions are important and are really necessary. So when we think about players, we know that traditional players in the area are important, occupy a digital space. Influencers are new stakeholders and new players in this digital food environment governance. And we can also think about tech companies and other companies that have participated in this interaction of technology companies. So, what is the possibility that we as a society have to speed up the digital accessibility? In the pandemic, this gained a lot of momentum. And there are very interesting moments if we think about what McDonald's has purchased technology companies, AI companies, as we see here in this slide. McDonald's acquires AI company to help automate drive-throughs. And we have the organization Food Industry Asia hosted a meeting to talk about food e-commerce across Asia. And the industry has been much faster than governments and academia, and innovations that look like science fiction. Look at this first autonomous fast food store. It is totally automated, no human interaction. So these are the new players that have arisen, and we need to focus on these changes because they really will be the new digital food environment. And we can also think about impact in terms of eating habits, consumer behavior, depending on what we choose, quote, and um, not choose on our diets, on our nutrition, and health outcomes, and which is the broader impact on society as a whole. Our systematic review showed that we really know very little about this impact, and that there are many individual studies that talk about the relationship between technology in the different areas that I presented previously in food preferences, choices, consumption. But we, due to the scope of our review, we are not focusing on individual studies, but we're studying on the possibility of working with systematic reviews that make a relationship between the different digital food analogic environments. And we found that no revision study identified or studied the impact, the real impact on body weight or nutritional status. But this systematic review papers and meta-analysis included show that the impact of digital marketing in food choice, preference, purchase, or purchase intention is real. So, um, digital marketing in the past as advert games changed, but this shows that based upon these pieces of information, we need to focus on these items further. So, in order to wrap up, I would like to talk about the interconnectivity between the physical and the digital environment from a different perspective, in a different layer of analysis that is separate and only occurs on the digital area. But as we made progress in our research, we realized that the physical and the digital environments are interconnected. There are studies that, based upon food mentioned on Twitter, on Instagram, and posts by users and other data in social media, some studies were able to predict desire. There is a connection between how people talk about certain foods and prevalence of obesity and diabetics, social consumption, and other variables I mentioned that has to do with the seasonality of food availability and the physical and the digital environments are the two sides of the same coin. And this has been increasingly clear. It is very difficult to understand the digital environment as a separate thing, which actually is the same phenomenon that is now using these new technologies. And my last comment and take home message is that the future is digital. Unless there is a catastrophe and all digital technologies are erased from Earth, the future is digital. Of course, this will vary, but the future is digital. So we really need to take very seriously all of these movements that are arising in social media. So thank you very much. This is my contact information, and I hope that you will uh, find the opportunity to publish further reviews and research work on digital food environments. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for your fantastic presentation, Sabrina.
And a lot of notes. I think you can follow this. We're going to reach the questions now. The chat box is full. So I'm going to make some comments to prepare for the debate. And I think that it's clear to us in all three of you the importance of investments in theoretical models because they're indispensable for us to better understand reality. They have a purpose of their own, per se, to allow this understanding, this better understanding. I always say here in our consortium of universities that prepared this event that it's as if we have different eyeglasses on to view this reality, and we can see the different aspects of this context, which is so complex. And another element was clear to me in your different ways that you approach this message is the importance of the theoretical models to orient the development of measurement tools which will allow progress in empirical studies on the topic. So I think that we have here in all three talks very creative typologies which contribute important elements. I want to value in Patricia's talk the importance of highlighting the domestic food environment as an environment itself and not mixed with the organizational like other models propose, acknowledge the unique characteristics. This is an important stride that had already happened in some studies, but you formalize this in your model with rich details. If you're not familiar with the publication, it's very rich. This publication by Patricia, the details in each model, the way that you describe the organizational model, which is one of the topics which I work with more. It's very rich as well, this approach. So there's an invitation, if you're not familiar, both the publication that Patricia showed and that by Shauna and Sabrina. Everyone should consult these references. We shared a few things in the chat box because they're very enriching the presentations, give us a basic idea of the depth that they dwelt on the topic. Shauna also has a very enriching typology and giving visibility to the issue of the informal food environment and this issue of the natural environment, which is overlooked in many models and neglected. At the center of attention, the issue of sustainability. This is indispensable for us to conceive how we can make changes in the food systems, effective changes that we discussed in the first roundtable today. And I think it's extremely useful that summary of the properties of sustainability in food environments, because that is a compass for us to conceive the spin-offs and developments of measurement tools, for example. And Sabrina puts a magnifying glass with a digital approach and the dynamism of this, the digital approach, and the importance of us understanding that when we're talking about the digital environment, it's not just the services, but information interactions. And this is already another element and a very rich element that you bring. And I believe that an important thing for us is in these three experiences here, these three efforts, is to truly for us to increasingly be more aware of the complexity of the food environments as contexts, as Elisabetta said in the previous session, at the end of the session, because this has huge implications in how we conceive interventions and public policies. And it's clear how we cannot be naive in conceiving these policies, because given the complexity of what you presented, it's clear to us that we truly need actions, integrated actions, linked action, and synergistic actions to in fact produce changes, effective changes in these food environments. Okay, great. I'm not going to list all the praise and the laudatory comments, but just more questions that we have now in the last 25 minutes that we have for our debate before 1 p.m. here in Rio. I'm going to address the questions to the three speakers, after which I think it's going to be easy to do it this way for them to be able to reflect on what they want to develop and elaborate a few generic questions. And we're going to be talking for each of the three. And afterwards, we're going to have a round of final comments. I believe it'll be better to do everything in one single block for us to not jeopardize that some questions be left unanswered if we leave them for a second section, which might not happen because of our time limitation. Okay, so for Patricia and Leticia Cardoso raised the issue of the importance of demarcating the connections between the different scenarios in the food environments, which is a really important aspect of your model. I think it would be, you could comment a little bit about more on this. Luana Lar values the issue of social capital, especially when we study vulnerable territories like slums and informal settlements. You could elaborate on social capital on that point. Patricia Larissa Mendez praises your work and asks how in Chile, if in Chile you are assessing the informal food environment as one of the public byways, and also it's present also in vulnerable neighborhoods. Larissa Rebosis asked Patricia to comment a little bit on the food system and artisanal food system in Chile, and Mariana Carvalho asks a question for Patricia and for Shauna. The theoretical advances have been extremely important to empower methodological advances and measurement of elements in the food environment that have been insufficiently investigated and are still invisible. How can we move forward with food environments, informal food environment research? So Mariana formalized this question, but this debate was happening in the chat box, this issue of the informal food environment. For Shauna, in addition to this question, there's another question from Leticia concerning, she talks about the inclusion of the informal market. It's extremely important. Again, this topic, we have to move forward with methods to evaluate these scenarios. So I'd like to hear more about this point with informal food environments from Shauna. And Patricia Paula Orta asks you the question, the issue of relevance of creating a tool to assess sustainability in the food environment. In fact, this is a limitation of the currently available instruments or tools, and she asks what would be the greatest challenges that the project teams has encountered in formulation of this, because it's a relatively new concept with little information available in the literature. For Sabrina, the questions more specifically were a reflection on how to do digital marketing of cause and effect by companies and not only NGOs as a company, how can a company survive? Leticia answered talking about that many of the hashtags appear as part of the social movement, the existing social movement, but the hashtags, but this is not totally explored. So it would be good to know if she could talk more about what you've thought about that. Sabrina, Leticia also asks concerning in terms of measurement for quantification of these environments, where do you think that the countries, the low and middle income countries should prioritize their efforts? And also Cecilia was asking the speakers, could be the case of all three answering that question. I would like to leave for Sabrina a question which pertains to the scenario that you talk about, shows us the major challenges if we consider that in relation to the agenda for regulatory measures and activities or actions. This is an arm of public policies, the regulatory agendas and the challenge of the regulatory agendas for the digital environment. Could you comment a little bit on that and talk about experiences that you're familiar with, if it's the case, and leave for all three of you to conclude this section of answers? What would you leave as your main take-home messages in terms of challenges and prospects for knowledge production and challenges and prospects for public policies? And we're going to continue now in the order of the presentations. I think there's another question here. Let me see just quickly. I think there are more questions streaming in, but I won't be able to ask all of the questions now. Let's begin now with Patricia from Chile to answer this set of questions. So thank you very much, Patricia.
Muchas gracias. Tomé nota de las preguntas.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I took down note of the questions. If I left anything out or missing, just tell me. Well, with reference to the limits of the different environments I presented, well, of course, each specific limit has its own characteristics that define these different levels, environments as such. I work with the domestic environment that depends on the organization environment as a sub-niche. For instance, in the domestic or the home food environment, we prepare breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But if children at school have breakfast or lunch or not, of course, this has a direct influence on the other environment. So these limits are overlapping, or there is an interaction amongst different environments without losing the essence of the school environment or the home environment. And this is also the case with these environments in which a family or a group of individuals is in the street environment. They purchase food in the streets, but they eat food purchased outside of the home at home. So it's very difficult to strictly say, no, 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 this is street food environment, this is home food environment. That is really not the case. It is really a very dynamic environment, but each environment defines itself differently. Well, social capital, what do we mean by that? The important thing that I want to mention here is with the pandemic in Chile, as was the case in many, many countries, there has been an increase of poverty and food insecurity increased during this pandemic, and a group of people could not have access to certain food environments because they earned less money, prices increased. So through social capital, there were kitchen soups and other civil society approaches to overcome this issue. The state could very well, instead of improving these environments, do nothing about it and said, okay, social cohesion, social capital, so let them solve their own problem. That is not the idea. The idea is to have and equitative access to food environment. So social cohesion is important with community resources in an equitable access, but the state cannot wash its hands from social cohesion and social capital. With reference to uh, artisan fishing, this is a very narrow and long country, and we have thousands and thousands of kilometers of shores. So fishing could be one of the bases of our food system. But unfortunately, there is a problem with artisan fisheries and a piece of legislation that is disfavorable for the daily task of fishermen. And the proposal is that fishermen say that this legislation favors the wealthy and the wealthy families and the wealthy companies against the equitable distribution of fish. And this is ultimately what happens with farm agriculture because our economic model favors large industrial conglomerates instead of favoring family farmers or family fishermen, or in our struggle to the right to food, we're fighting for food sovereignty in a more equitable manner for our farmers, for our fishermen, because if we really want sustainability in our food environment, this will be difficult if we don't take care about our own. And what about street environment studies? There are no national recent studies on this environment, the street environment. There are some articles and studies that specifically talk about some areas of the country that show, and of course, this is related to migration flows, international migration flows, uh, the integrity of foodstuffs sold in the streets. There are some funds available, which are funds to support food entrepreneurs and innovators and some street vendors that sell fruit, juice, but with better facilities. I mean, there is financing available for these street vendors that have trucks or stalls. But when we talk about the illegal street vendors, there is no information because it's difficult to have access to these illegal street vendors. And food access in vulnerable populations, we have been working on this, and we have some preliminary results that haven't been published. I work specifically in the home environment of vulnerable families to understand the availability and interactions amongst family members. Hopefully, we will have results shortly, and we will compare some of NEM's perception forms to see which are the perceptions of the different social and economic l- levels to see whether this is reflected in the consumption of elements. I think this is it. I don't know if I missed anything. Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments, Patricia. Now I give Shauna the floor, and then we can start with the final round of comments. Shauna?
Great, thank you. So I'll start with the question related to the informal food environment and some of the challenges related to measuring it. So anyone who has worked in informal food environments knows it's very challenging to measure. And I won't say that I have the answers in terms of how to do it. I think that the toolbox is meant to really help with it because we will develop tools that are specific to the informal food environment. What I'll say is that over the course of my work over the last probably seven or 8 years or so, we've gotten better at figuring out how to measure things a little bit better. So it's often been very much trial and error. So I started doing some food environment work in the informal food environment sector in Myanmar and tried to use some tools that already existed, including some of the Informist tools from Boyd Swinburne's group, but just found that they weren't very applicable in the settings I was working in. And since then, I've started to figure out different ways of doing things. And I think one of the things that has been the most useful for me in my work is talking to people first. So I generally do use mixed methods approaches to looking at the food environment. So I definitely measure the objective or external food environment and things like the availability of food, its affordability, that type of thing. But at the same time, I think it's incredibly important to talk to people about how they interact with their own food environment. And that helps us to better understand how to actually capture that food environment through the methods that we have. So for example, for a lot of the work that I've done in informal settlements in Kenya, we've started with interviews in this case, it was with women, to understand what drives their food choices, how they interact with their food environment. And then that's really informed our mapping of the environment. And in those settings, because they're informal settlements, it's possible to map all of the vendors. Well, it's difficult though. So for that, we actually mapped using GIS mapping all the different types of vendors included in the settlements, and then also collected data on the availability, price, and quality of different foods. But this is really challenging, and you need to work with community members. So as part of that work and the mapping, we worked with community mappers who have already an organization that maps different assets within the community. And that was incredibly important because there's so much dynamism within informal food environments. So if you go to map the vendors in the morning, you might see different vendors than you will in the evening. And so that creates challenges because you're not going to capture the whole environment. So that for that reason, it's really critical to work with community members and to have them actually be your data collectors. And that seems to have worked really well with the populations that I've worked with. And it also creates more community engagement around food within the environments that those people are living. And they seem to get more interested in terms of their food environment and what can be done to address some of the issues within it. So I think that's one aspect that has helped me in terms of my assessment of the informal food environment. The second question related to sustainability and the greatest challenges with trying to incorporate it into food environment measures is a great one. And it's something that I've really struggled with. And I've been talking with colleagues over the last few years about how we can do this well. And sustainability is so hard because there's so many factors involved. When we think about the definition of sustainable diets, for example, it encompasses so many different things, the cultural aspect, the social aspects, economic. And so that can be really challenging in terms of thinking about which aspects do we want to measure then in the food environment. The other thing that's really difficult in terms of its measurement is that a lot of it is invisible. So as a consumer, we might not know when we go to the grocery store and are selecting, which banana or tomato to purchase. We're not going to necessarily know how that was produced. Was the farmer paid in an equitable way? What were the greenhouse gas emissions or water footprints related to the production of this food? So that creates a lot of challenges too, because even when we try and think about what we could measure within the food environment related to sustainability, it really comes down to only a few things that are visible, things like packaging, labeling, and that type of thing. So there's that challenge. And then on top of that, I think the challenge related to greenwashing, where we're seeing more and more marketing that's related to sustainability properties. And it's not necessarily meaning that that product is more sustainable. So we're seeing the same kind of approaches that we see from a health perspective in terms of, using front of pack labeling to try and entice people to eat poor quality foods, ultra processed foods in general. We're seeing that with sustainability as well. So I think that's another challenge. And then on top of that, the challenge related to the trade-offs. And so because sustainability is so complex. Even if the consumer has information related to the way food was produced and, let's say, the water footprint and the carbon footprint, it will be very difficult for them to make decisions based on that information because they don't necessarily have all of the knowledge related to how to aspects of sustainability. And so I think that creates challenges too in terms of how we measure it. And then the last aspect that makes it difficult is just in terms of production practices, they very much differ from different places in the world. They're different places in a given country. So I could get beef, for example, that's produced not too far from where I live, or I could get beef that, you know, the feed was produced in one country and then the animal in the ocean. And so it looks very different from one product to the next or one food item to the next. And I think that knowledge of the supply chain, so what is going on upstream in the supply chain, isn't really available for us. So that creates additional challenges. So I encourage you, though, if you're interested in this, as part of our grant, we are planning to do a Delphi survey with experts in the food environment to understand what aspects of things like sustainability they think is important to capture within the food environment. So please feel free to send me an email if this is something that you're interested in, and we can stay in touch through that, as well as other work. And I think just the last point related to, I'm just looking at the time, the last point related to the take-home message, I think for me, the biggest take-home message related to food environment work is talking to people and understanding how they interact with their environments, because that's really how you're going to understand what needs to be done in terms of measuring food environment, if that's what you're trying to do, but also more importantly, how we can intervene within it. So if we know how consumers are interacting with their environment and what is influencing or driving their food choices, it makes it a lot easier to identify which interventions or programs are necessary to try and influence them to eat better in a more healthy way, but also a more sustainable way. So I think I'll leave it at that so that Sabrina has time to chat as well.
All the topics that you're mentioning are so important and interesting, and the methodological approaches, we really need to be more creative, Shauna, and more comprehensive in terms of methodologies to include such complex issues. Sabrina, tell us, which are your last comments? Wow, so many comments. I could even make a new presentation about all of these comments and interesting comments. But let me I know we're running late, but I would like to talk about informality. Jonas made a very important comment that I didn't mention, but it is essential and has to do with unequal access to technology. When I talk about the digital food environment and that it is adapted to different contexts, we need to consider the fact that technology access is not a universal access. And this, of course, is related to the topic of how we can configure this digital food environment. But it is not, because we have a low income population, that they will not have access to technology. That is a fallacy. We have to understand the context we're studying, which are the technologies and how can we use these technologies, how we can regulate, how public policies should regulate this, or how this will evolve. It is not a new fact that very remote and distant communities in Africa or Asia use mobile technologies for social security, for banking services or healthcare. These activities do take place. And to give you a Brazilian example that is connected with informality of the food system, which I guess is fantastic, our services I heard about in Brazil of food sale in WhatsApp restaurants. Instead of having a site or an app, no, they directly send you a WhatsApp with the menu, and they sell their products on WhatsApp. And this is an informality in a way. So the context is essential, but it is important to think that more vulnerable populations do not use technology, because it's not the case. So it is important to really keep an eye on this. Well, the young. We need to remember that today, the young, and I have um, included young women in my research. I know that my age group has different approaches to what digital food is. Young 18, 20-year-old girls or young women, for them, things have always been like this. So we need to consider that younger populations and the young and digital native, which is also important, is a fallacy. Not all young know how to deal with technology as we assume they do. So they will build the next stages in this digital food environment. And to talk about the legal framework, promotion, where we start, um, the idea, I mean, technology is not a new thing, but the idea of studying the concept of digital food environment is the following. We focus on the different boxes and components, bricks, let's say, that make up the digital food environment, but there are many gaps. So where to start your research? Well, will depend on the challenge in this specific context. Marketing is one of the most studied topics. And according to my research, online marketing, online supermarket, and delivery apps and labeling are the least studied areas. This could be a starting point to understand how this sector has developed, because the food industry is already in this conversation, and we need to understand what's going on. And we need to focus on how current policies and legal framework apply to this online environment. Uh, in our review, we saw that few countries, maybe Italy is one of the few, that have legislation that is applicable to digital food environment. There are many gaps, and there are very few experiences that account for this. And it's interesting to note that when we talk about policies, we not only talk about regulation, what's forbidden, we also need to talk about how this space can be used in a partnership with influencers or other nerds, maybe partnerships with the Ministry of Health for in favor of vaccination, for instance, was the case. And there are many partnerships that can be created. So the fact of what has to be prevented, and then how we can positively use media. And I see a lot of opportunities. So my take-home message would be exactly this one. We have to take technology very seriously. Social media is very serious because they are part of the world today. And we have to identify these opportunities, not only focus on what we need to stop. Of course, yes, regulate, yes, legal framework, yes, but focus on opportunities. Thank you. Thank you, Sabrina. Great. Well, I think that this is it for this morning. Fantastic. The three of you had the possibility to elaborate your answers, and we had time for the three of you. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia, Shauna, and Sabrina, for this interesting moment of conversation. It is fantastic. How fantastic. What a pleasure and a privilege to have the three of you today this morning. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I invite all of the participants with the afternoon program and agenda. Thank you very much again, Sabrina, Shauna, Patricia, and see you later. Goodbye.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really good.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. I have to jump on another call. Okay, bye.